We are here today with Alena Luciani, so I'm going to actually pronounce that right. And we are going to be talking about just your journey into entrepreneurship, how you started training to excel. So about like who you are and what is your business. Let's start with that.
I am a strength and conditioning coach, educator, and founder of Training to Excel. But I also like to say that I'm a lifelong athlete, and a lot of what I do as a strength conditioning coach and as an entrepreneur with Training to Excel really stems from my upbringing in sport. So much of what I built my business on are these like foundational principles I learned as an athlete. And essentially, I'm trying to create the athlete lifestyle and environment for individuals that used to have it. So, like retired athletes that miss having that, or individuals that maybe weren't lucky enough to play a team sport and have that group and team environment for them to work towards a common goal with other individuals. And so I'm trying to create that for my athletes in sport and my athletes in life. And within Training to Excel, I wear a lot of hats, as I'm sure all the entrepreneurs you're speaking with say the same thing. But what's really cool is I feel like over the past several years, I've been able to kind of build two aspects of my business. So I have the House of Training to Excel, which is where I service athletes in sport, athletes in life with programming and coaching and small group training and ebooks and a ton of other resources to help individuals excel in the game of life. And then I have the School of Training to Excel, which is for strength conditioning coaches, personal trainers, movement practitioners. And it's the education sector of my business where I have online courses, I offer mentorship, I run in person clinics. And that's been a really special part to build because I think that's the part that was missing for me when I was a collegiate strength coach. So I kind of grew up, quote unquote, in the strength and conditioning world in collegiate athletics. And as much as we were in a position to educate the athletes, and in some environments, I had the opportunity to help kind of train our student coaches, but I felt like there were some pockets, and there are some pockets of continuing education that I feel like there's a little bit of a void. So that's where I get to kind of fill things in.
Kind of give us a little bit more context in terms of how did you become an entrepreneur? Tell me
Mhm.
a little bit about like how did you become a strength and conditioning coach, and how did that lead you into entrepreneurship?
I actually purposely didn't mention that part because I'm like, I feel like I could talk so long about that. So I'll try to do like the Coles Notes version. But,
Okay.
as I mentioned, having been an athlete all my life, and I was fortunate enough to be a varsity athlete in university. So I played 4 years of basketball and a year of lacrosse while doing my kin degree. But prior to that, having grown up with two older brothers who also played a varsity sport, also at Laurier, so I kind of just followed what they were doing. But when I was in high school and I really started to realize that I wanted to play sport at the next level, specifically basketball, my brothers were the ones that instilled in me that, there's not only the work ethic on the court, but there's also the work that you do off the court. And at first I was kind of like, well, no, I'm just going to put up thousands of shots and do a bunch of ball handling. And my brother's like, well, no, you actually have to be strong and like you have to be well conditioned. And so I started going to the gym and following their lead and starting my strength training journey and started doing conditioning on my own. And then I started to see how that clicked on the court, and I was like, wow, life is so much easier when you're strong and when you're well conditioned and can last the whole game. So that's really, I think, when the wheels started turning for the strength and conditioning side of things as an athlete at that point.
Mhm.
And then when in grade 12, I took the exercise science class, or kind of intro to kinesiology. And I knew I wanted to be involved in sport in some capacity when I got older. I didn't know what that looked like at the time. But then after taking that class, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. I could study essentially the movement of sport and human movement. I was like, that is super cool. So that's what led me to do my kin degree. And of course, when I was going into kinesiology, people that I shared that with said, oh, so you're going to be a physiotherapist or a phys ed teacher. And both of those occupations are wonderful. But I was like, there's got to be more options than just those two things.
Right.
And so I got a really unique opportunity when I was in my second year. I actually had a training facility reach out to me, and they were reaching out to student athletes that were in kin, because oftentimes that's kind of a good combo for strength conditioning. So they had reached out, and actually just before that I had started personal training at the athletic complex at Laurier. And so when I got this opportunity at this training facility, this was my first opportunity to work with other high performance athletes. And I remember after that summer, that's when the switch really flipped for me, that it's like, oh my gosh, I want to be a strength conditioning coach.
Mm.
It was just like all of my favorite things. It was like all the stuff I was learning in my classes. It was the strength training component, and also like the mindset behind it and the work ethic and the kind of intangible things of being a really strong athlete, and also just like the connection piece. I feel like I've always been a pretty social being, so I always love connecting with people, and it just gave me a different platform to do that. And I never really pictured myself sitting behind a desk. So I was like, oh,
Yeah.
this is like a pretty cool opportunity. So I did my kinesiology degree at Laurier. And just as I finished, I did my CSCS. I got a really unique opportunity to work full time at Laurier as the head strength coach for 2 years.
Wow.
After those 2 years, I chose to continue my education and pursue my master's. So I did my master's in sports science and recreation with a distinction in coaching at Ohio University, which was really, really awesome. Just being able to be in a different environment in collegiate athletics. I don't like to compare U Sport and NCAA because they're just very different, and there's
Mm.
different resources allocated to each. But it was just really, really cool to get a new perspective and work with new coaches. And I learned a lot that year. And then I came home and started working at York University. All the while, I had graduating athletes come to me and say, Alena, I don't know what to do in the gym. Can you write me a program? And I'm like, of course you know what to do in the gym. But I understood where they were coming from, because they were going from having their team meetings, their practices, their everything's scheduled, their workouts, like everything's set up for us as varsity athletes. So it's like when we leave, if you don't have that time management, you don't have that discipline to do it yourself, like it can go out the window.
Mhm.
So my mom is actually an entrepreneur, has two of her own businesses. And so she's the one that said, if people are going to pay you for writing them a program, you should register yourself as a business. So I did that on November 28th of 2015. And I thought, yeah, like in my head, I was like, eventually I want to run my own business. Cause after watching my mom do it, it was very much a possibility. Whereas I know individuals that maybe didn't grow up around other entrepreneurs, it wasn't something that was like, oh, yeah, this is an option. Like, this is something you can do. So I knew at some point, but I definitely put pressure on myself to have more experience or be older or have more degrees or have more letters beside my name, because I put this unrealistic standard and just said I have to be 40 and have a PhD before I do that.
Mm.
And that's silly looking back on that. But in the summer between my master's and working at York, I very suddenly lost my dad. And I share that because that was a very pivotal moment for me.
Mm.
I would refer to it as my TSN turning point in a lot of ways, because I kept putting this like, oh, I'll wait. Oh, after I've worked at several more universities. And then when that happened, I was like, life is too short.
Mm.
So after my contract at York came to an end, I resigned from my full time position. I just said, I'm going to give myself a year with Training to Excel. I'm going to see what happens. And at the time, it was just a side thing. It was like I was programming for people, I was making ebooks, I was writing a blog, which was fun,
Yeah.
just doing little things like that. I started the Instagram account, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to give myself a year and see what happens. And I'm happy to say that that was April of 2018. And
Wow.
it's September of 2024. So here we are. A lot has changed, but
Yeah. What has been one of the biggest challenges for you as a business owner?
I am actually going to talk about something that I feel like I've been feeling more recently. And I feel like it's a combination of things. So, being a solo entrepreneur is very lonely. And I
Mm.
feel like that's something that I've really started to realize. It's an interesting feeling to like constantly be surrounded by people, but still feel very alone. And that might be getting like a little bit deep, but that's truly how I feel. It's like, I feel like I'm always in the position of being the facilitator, and I'm always trying to like help manage people's emotion and energy and make sure that the environment, feels really positive. And I think just lately, it's almost started to catch up to me a little bit,
Okay.
just in constantly giving so much to other people and also wearing so many different hats. So it's like I mentioned to one of my athletes a couple weeks ago, something went wrong on the back end of my website. And so I was just running a little bit late to a session because I'm like trying to put out this fire. And I'm like, I'm IT today. Like I am, on the back end going in and like trying to fix the coding in the back. Like
Mm.
I didn't go to school for that.
Yeah.
And as much as it is really, I do find it actually very rewarding to kind of go through things and figure it out on my own. I think sometimes it can just become a lot because then, if I'm late to that session, it then has a domino effect. And I also just like don't like showing up late for things. So it's just, then it causes a little bit of anxiety. So I think it's a combination of things, but what it boils down to is I think just like really being on your own with things, which in some ways is really empowering. Like when I reflect back on how much Training to Excel has grown, I'm like, okay, it's a bit of a flex that I could say, I did this primarily by myself with support in different ways in different areas, but it's pretty cool that like I'm able to, build and operate a business by myself. And it can also be really lonely sometimes.
Mm.
And so that's something I'm navigating right now, and I'm trying to get creative and figure out different ways around that, but I'm sure it's something that a lot of entrepreneurs can relate to because yeah, it's just it can be a lonely journey sometimes.
For myself, um, quite often it's like you have all these ideas and you want to like there's like this brainstorming and you want to figure out interesting ways to do things and like new offers and ways to troubleshoot your own problems, and you're doing that by yourself a lot of the time, and you can't always like throw that on your partner,
Yeah.
because they can't be there, like they can't like fill that role for like every single role, right? And so,
Mhm.
anyway, yes, that when you're always troubleshooting and brainstorming, for me, I feel like that's what makes it sometimes feel lonely. What about for
For
you?
sure. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I'm very, very fortunate that my husband is a very incredible support. And if anyone listening along is either an entrepreneur themselves or is a partner to an entrepreneur,
Mhm.
I know I can make things challenging sometimes, and he is just really really awesome at, even if it's just allowing me to like text him a bunch of like different bullet points, and then
Right.
when he's between meetings he can kind of like take a peek. And I was like voice noting him with this podcast thing that we were talking about before, and he's trying to be helpful kind of like in the small pockets of his day, which I really appreciate. So I always want to acknowledge that. I think what I've been struggling with is putting the pressure on myself to always show up 100%.
Mhm.
And even when I'm not feeling 100%. So in the summer, it's the anniversary of my dad's passing. And just like a lot comes up in like the span of like 4 or 5 weeks. So it's like it's Father's Day, it's his birthday, the day he had the heart attack, the day he passed. So it's just like
Wow.
grief, and grief is just like so unpredictable. You just never know when she's gonna make an appearance.
Yeah.
But it is challenging sometimes to like, feel anxiety or feel sad and then have to walk through the gym doors and kind of like paint a smile on your face and be like, because the people that I work with are also struggling and also going through hard times. So I want to be there for them. But then it's like you kind of take on all of these emotions and, everything that your people are going through. And I come home and I'm just like, yeah, I won't lie, I feel anxious, I feel overwhelmed. And then, unfortunately, I do a really good job of kind of like suppressing things when I'm like in the gym, and I try to be really attentive. But I just think, yeah, like I said, I think it's just like starting to catch up with me a little bit. And when you're the one always facilitating things,
Hmm.
yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of energy. And I truly, truly love what I do. That's why I continue to move through even challenging times,
Hmm.
but it doesn't mean it's easy. So,
Yeah. Is there
yeah.
anything that you've found, like anything you've done that you feel like is helping you cope with some of that loneliness and just that overwhelm taking on other people's emotions?
I think like communicating it, especially to my husband, because if I'm not feeling great and then he comes home, it like makes me feel bad that I'm not 100% for him.
Mhm.
But I've gotten better at just communicating like, hey, this is like how I'm feeling right now, and trying to not suppress things when I am in a safe space. So when I do come home, it's like allowing myself to feel the feels. I think just like being really like communicative about how I feel, and giving myself grace to like feel what I need to feel. I
Mhm.
think sometimes we as entrepreneurs probably downplay like just how much goes on in our heads each and every
Mhm.
day. And, especially when I know I'm very hard on myself as it is. I do try to be really transparent with how I'm feeling to my inner circle. So
Mhm.
it's like if I'm not on my game, it's like, hey, this is what's going on, this is how I'm feeling, and just being really honest about it, as opposed to then going home and then suppressing more feelings. And then I think the other part of it is like enjoying the in between moments. So it's like, there's this whole concept on social media of like romanticizing like your coffee and stuff, which I know can be silly sometimes, but I kind of love it. Like, I'm
Mhm.
like, I kind of love this because it's just like those in between pockets of time where it's like maybe it's a long shower. Maybe it's like listening to a good podcast or like your favorite playlist in the car. Maybe it's like, the silly interactions you have with your partner, or, maybe it's like the walk that you're taking to go to your next destination, but you're, like I said, you're like listening to something you enjoy or having a good conversation.
Mhm.
It's, I think, appreciating and really being present in those in between moments that has also been really helpful for me. I don't keep track of the coffees that I buy out because it's just like that's one of those things. That's how I treat myself in the summer. It's
Mhm.
like, where am I getting my coffee from today? Mostly because I don't have time to make it at home. But also, that's like my little, like, ooh, I have 15 minutes. Where am I going to go and get my coffee? And that for me is like, I love it.
Would you say you have a work-life balance, and how have you created that for yourself, if so?
So I kind of see it from like a macro cycle perspective and a
Okay.
micro cycle perspective. So
Okay.
I think in linear periodization. But when I think from a micro cycle perspective, I think of the things I do in my day to offset maybe higher stress situations. So I have kind of a list of non negotiable habits that I incorporate each and every day that I know make me feel at my best. So, at bare minimum, I've done these very small things that help just like align me for the day, that help kind of like pour back into my cup a little bit. So, examples of this is movement in some capacity, whether that's a long walk, a run, a training session, uh meditation. So I use the Headspace app every morning. I've only been able to do it for 5 minutes a day, but even that 5 minutes just gives me that 5 minutes. It's, my hydration, and I do kind of be mindful of things like steps and stuff because I know it just feels better when I'm moving and, getting some time outside. So from a microcycle, it's like those are the things that I think about that help balance out everything else. So I really kind of barricade my mornings and my morning routine to allow myself to put myself in a position to be my best for others throughout the day. And then if we think of like that mesocycle, it's like when we look at like a week, I do my best to kind of protect Sundays as a day where I can refill my cup a little bit. Whether that's enough sometimes, maybe not. It kind of depends on what's happening, but it just gives me one day, even if it's just like quality time with my husband. And then from a macro cycle, I kind of look at my year and how it generally ebbs and flows. So I don't tend to do a lot of travel in the spring and summer months. So like a lot of my personal travel happens more towards the end of the year. My husband and I love the holidays. We just like there's certain places we like to visit. Our anniversary is around that time. So it's like from a macro cycle perspective, it's like I feel like having some things in the calendar to look forward to. For me, travel and adventure is definitely one of those things. You know, if someone looked at my schedule, some people might be like, whoa, that is so out of whack. Like you just work so much. But I think quote unquote work life balance looks different for everyone, but especially looks different for entrepreneurs. Like
Mhm.
sometimes, in a lot of cases, my work does fill my cup. And there's also aspects of what I do that is quite draining. So again, looking at that like micro, meso, and macro cycle, it's
Mm.
like, what can I do each day to just fill into my cup a little bit to offset maybe some of the, higher stress situations? What can I do when I look at my week? Okay, there's one day where I'm not in the gym and no one can book me on a Sunday. And from like a macro cycle, it's like, you know what, the holiday season, like I work my butt off January to, November. In most cases, I'm still working through December as well. But, we do a little bit more travel at that time. And I'm not as like I have to pack my schedule because my schedule is pretty packed the rest of the year. So
Hmm.
again, is that right? I don't know. I don't think there is a right or wrong way to have work-life balance. It's just you got to
Right,
figure
right.
out what works for you.
How long did it take you to kind of sort that out for yourself or to get really intentional about that? Was that something you set up right away? Did it take a few years?
I have always been a very type A individual. I've always been very disciplined. It's something that there's not a lot I take pride in just because I'm pretty hard on myself and I always feel like there's areas to improve. But something I do take a lot of pride in is my discipline. I was like that as an athlete. I had very specific like pregame routines and rituals, and so I feel like I've just adapted those in my adult life to be those things that I spoke to before. But I think, as I grow and evolve as a coach and as a business owner, I also think my boundaries evolve and the things that I need. Like, there was one point where I would go 3 weeks in a row before a day with nothing on the calendar and I wouldn't, bat an eye. And then, I actually think things shifted a little bit in the pandemic when, all of a sudden I started working only Mondays to Fridays and I was like, "Oh my gosh, wow, I actually feel so much better when I have time on the weekends." And I think like as I get older too, like quality time is one of my love languages and quality time with my husband is really important to me. So it's like I also want to I think in a marriage too, it's different because it's just like I also want to show up for him. And it's not fair to him if I'm just like, oh no, I have to work. And there are days when I do have to make those sacrifices and he's very understanding of that. But it's like I'm also like, I'm not just doing it for me, I'm doing it for us. And I'm doing it
Hmm.
for my family and wanting to show up for the people in my life. Again, I think when you go through a loss like I did with my dad, it also just like really makes you realize how important that quality time is. So, there are some days where I was like, oh, I should be getting this done. I'm like, no, instead I'm going to go hang out with my mom for an hour and I'm going to have coffee with her and the work will be there when I'm done. And
Hmm.
this when I look back on my week, this is going to be a highlight. It's not that I like finished a newsletter an hour earlier than I had planned to, like,
Yeah.
so I just think like your priorities shift as you get older.
Hmm.
And I think I've just become more cognizant of like what's really, really valuable. And it's like also reminding myself part of why I became an entrepreneur was to have more flexibility with my time.
Right.
So I need to at some point learn how to take advantage of that.
Right. You're like, what's the purpose of doing this and taking on this risk if I'm not getting the one of the benefits I'm looking for?
One of the like, let's call it like one of the
Advantages.
few benefits. Like, so I have tried to be more cognizant of that. But again, things ebb and flow. And like, of course, the pandemic like totally changed everything about everyone's business. So there are some things from that time that I'm like, oh, you know what? I really appreciated shutting down by this time. And I'm
Yeah.
going to continue that forward. And I think just like as I get older, I'm not going to say I'm great at setting boundaries, but I'm better than I was.
How did the pandemic change your business? So obviously it shifted your schedule and some of your priorities as well. How else did it change your business?
So prior to the pandemic, this kind of brings me back to the school of training to excel. Prior to the
Hmm.
pandemic, I was running in person clinics. And when I started them, I knew at some point I wanted to bring them online, just strictly based off the reach that it would allow me to get
Yeah.
versus just running it in one city or doing kind of like one city at a time. And I feel like the pandemic just pushed that or moved that along a little bit quicker. So instead of, again, giving myself this timeline of like, oh, in a couple of years, it was like as soon as the pandemic hit, I kind of reformatted things into an online kind of cohort. So we broke up what would be an 8 hour clinic and we kind of did like 2 hours a week, or it was like 1 hour for 8 weeks. And that was really awesome. That was a lot of fun. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, it would be so much easier if I didn't have to like lecture the entire time and just more, had more time and space to answer questions. So then I was like, I'm going to start filming these lessons to go into modules. And it's like, so it allowed, I think, that side of things to evolve a little bit quicker than had it not happened, which was really, really special. And I think like the introduction of virtual training and showing people that there's a lot of opportunities to do things, even if we're not in the same city or in the same gym. I think that was a really cool side of it. And I do try to reflect and acknowledge that I'm like, oh, it actually forced me to do some things that were really good for my business. And funny enough, before that, I had always been very envious of people or of entrepreneurs that had set up this like online side of their business to allow them more freedom and flexibility. And in the back of my head, I was like, I would love for Ryan and I to be able to like go somewhere for a month and I can still work and I can still operate my business, but not be like in one specific gym. So I had already started building the online side of my business. So when the pandemic happened, I already had a lot of infrastructure set up for certain programs and ebooks and different offerings that it wasn't a total like I have to change everything. It was like, oh, okay, now I'm just going to put a little bit more effort into this. Or now, as I mentioned with the courses, I'm going to take this and now I'm going to record them in modules. And now I have a whole library of online courses, which allow me to reach people far beyond the city of Toronto.
How did you end up with two different facets, like the in-person coaching or even virtual coaching, and then the coaching the coaches?
So, what I realized working in the collegiate setting is I'm a very multi passionate individual. So, I still love writing programs and, being hands on and coaching team sessions and coaching people one on one. Like, I still love that. But then I just found that there were like other skills that I had that I wasn't really able to tap into in some ways. And, when my dad was alive, my dad was a longtime educator and coach. So he was a teacher, he was a vice principal, he was a principal, and coached at every school he was ever at. And I remember he watched me present on something once and he looked at me and he said, oh, Elena, you need to be in the classroom. And I thought, I love you so much, Dad. I will never be a teacher. God bless the teachers out there. But I was like, because I'm thinking just very much in the traditional sense. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but I worked summer school one summer and I was like, that is the last time I'm ever stepping foot in a classroom that I'm not the student in. It just wasn't for me.
Mhm.
And then I remember the moment I had run, it was my first kind of like big clinic in the fall of 2018. And I remember I had just lectured on something and then everyone was in breakout groups and I just had the opportunity to kind of go around and kind of watch everyone going through this breakout activity. And I got emotional because I was like, oh my God, this is what he meant.
Mhm.
Like he just wanted me to find my version of a classroom.
Wow.
He didn't mean it in a traditional sense. I think he just wanted me to be in an environment that I can teach others.
Mhm.
And that was really powerful for me. And the education side of things can be a bit intimidating because it's like I am a small fish in a big pond and there are a lot of people that are much smarter than me and have a lot more experience than me doing it, but I'm like I just have this gut feeling though that I'm like I have something special. And I don't mean that in a cocky way, but I think one skill that I've tried to take more ownership of is my ability to take something complex and distill it down to something that's digestible.
Mm.
Like I said, it can be intimidating to be in the education space. And I just keep coming back to like, I think I'm really meant to do this and I'm just going to keep moving forward with it. And from a business standpoint, it's like my courses, that's a much easier way to scale than adding more one-on-one sessions
Mhm.
to my schedule. So even just from like a business standpoint, I knew I had to figure out a way to scale what I was doing. And I think the education side of things allows me to do that.
Is there any advice that you'd give to other business owners?
If a door isn't open, either kick it open or build your own door. It's like either if you want that door, it's like create the opportunity for yourself. And I feel like, there's the cliche like when one door closes, another one opens. Sometimes the door closes for like not great reasons. So it's like if you really believe that like that's an opportunity that's meant for you, like take initiative, like be persistent with things. There have been so many situations where like yeah, of course when you like launch a product or a service, sometimes things don't work out, but it doesn't mean that that door is closed. Maybe it just means you have to build the door a little bit differently. Maybe the lock wasn't appropriate. Maybe it was the wrong handle. And just by changing that one thing, all of a sudden it's like, ooh, then you hear the click and then the door, like, and then it's like, okay, this is what it was meant to look like.